Thank you so much for being on the programme today. It's such an important day. Finally, the survivors, the families of those who so tragically lost their lives in Grenfell have got some answers. What's your reaction to the inquiry's findings?
Well, the tragedy was heartbreaking, and reading the report has been gut-wrenching. It's been confirmed today by the inquiry chair that every single one of these 72 deaths, these souls that perished, they include 18 children, 15 disabled residents. Every single death was avoidable. And that's gut-wrenching to read. We have in black and white the chair to the inquiry, and they sat for more than 400 days, concluding there was systematic dishonesty, corporate greed, institutional indifference, neglect, and incompetence. And if that was hard for me to read, I know the bereaved, the survivors and the residents have had a really difficult couple of days. The two things they've said to me regularly since June the 14th, and I remember that morning so vividly when I went down to Grenfell Tower, is they want those responsible to be held to account. That's still not happened. And they want reassurance that this can never happen again, and it can happen again 7 years on.
Yeah, as you say, it's gut-wrenching to hear that every single one of those deaths was avoidable. The inquiry criticises some politicians, it criticises the London Fire Brigade. In particular, it criticises these three companies responsible for the building materials. Do we need to be looking at criminal charges and prosecutions?
Well, I'm asking the government today to make sure any company named in the report today, who the chair blames, should no longer be able to get any contracts that uses taxpayers' money, whether it's the insulation companies, whether it's the cladding companies, anybody named in the report today. That should happen straight away, because these companies, systematically dishonest, greedy, neglectful, are still getting contracts where us taxpayers are leading to having profits and doing well. That's the first thing that must happen. The second thing which I welcome today is Keir Starmer confirming he'll make sure there's additional support in terms of resources provided to the police and the CPS to make sure they can conclude their investigations. We know it's been 7 years already. I actually support the police and the CPS waiting for the inquiry to be over before they completed their investigations, but there are thousands of pages of evidence to go through, many witnesses that need to be spoken to. So I'm afraid the distress and the frustration and the anger the community have is going to be prolonged, because it will take some time before the police and the CPS reach their conclusions.
When you say that you support the fact that the police and the CPS waited till after the inquiry, but it's been years and years and years, you can understand the families' frustrations. They want someone to be held responsible for this.
I completely share the families' frustration, the bereaved frustrations, the survivors' frustrations, the residents' frustrations. It's been more than 7 years. One of the first things I did back in June 2017 was implore on the then Prime Minister to get a public inquiry sorted pretty quickly and to get moving pretty quickly. That didn't happen. We are where we are. What I welcome is the response today from Keir Starmer. He's the fifth Prime Minister since the tragedy occurred. And his response today was really important. Today should be the moment when there is some progress seen in relation to a turning point, in relation to how those who are housed in social housing are treated. And one of the things the report also concludes is the residents were treated appallingly before, during and after the fire. I'm afraid issues of race and social class are relevant to the way they were treated.
It's a pause for thought for all of us, your words there about how people were treated. I just wonder as well if there are political lessons too, because many people will look at this and say that this shows the dangers of trying to deregulate, to try and kind of cut red tape, if you like. Others will say there may be a risk that the pendulum swings too far the other way at a time when we need housing, we're putting up barriers for housing being built. What do you think the lesson is when it comes to regulation?
Well, it's there in black and white from this report that's more than 1,400 pages long. One of the reasons for the systematic dishonesty, the corporate greed, the institutional incompetence, the neglect, the indifference was deregulation, and privatisation. And when you look at the recommendations, there are 58 of them. Many of them do recommend, as you suggest, more regulation, more oversight, people not marking their own homework. And it is possible to build many, many new homes and for them to be safe, for them to be good places to live and for them to be good homes. I think there's not a choice between more housing or better standards. I think it's a basic human right to live in a safe home that is a good quality home. And here's the point that makes me really angry. It is still the case today, in September 2024, that according to the London Fire Brigade, there are more than 1,300 residential buildings that are not safe when it comes to fires. And in London alone, we have more than 8,000 tall buildings when you compare the rest of the country put together. There's no reason for them to be unsafe but for cutting corners. And that's why I welcome the chair saying corporate greed was one of the reasons why lives were lost. We've got to avoid companies cutting corners because of greed.
I just want to sort of take a moment to get your own reflections, because, you know, you said how clearly you remember Grenfell. I remember it so well too, you know, just reading about the awful stories, the people who lived in those flats, how they tried to escape, the people who sadly lost their lives. Is there anyone in particular that you'll be thinking about today?
I try not to talk about how I feel because there are families who are grieving, but I can still feel the heat and the smell the next morning. But it's hard for the families. Forget me, these families have lost loved ones. They'll never be the same again. And that's why it's really important Keir said what he said today.
Yeah, it's right. And it is a time to kind of reflect on what happened. And as you say, to try and learn those lessons from such an unbelievable tragedy that shaken everyone in so many ways. While I have you, there is one other story that I would like to ask you about as well, which is the government's decision to implement a partial arms embargo on Israel. It's a controversial decision. Do you think that Keir Starmer got it right?
I was in the High Court when the new Lord Chancellor and the Attorney General and the Solicitor General took their oath. And one of the things that the new Attorney General, the new Lord Chancellor and the new Solicitor General said is they would abide by the rule of law and would make sure due process was followed. And I welcome the fact that this government is following the rule of law and following due process. So the Attorney Generals obviously looked into issues in relation to what the Israeli government is doing. The Justice Secretary, the Foreign Secretary, the Defence Secretary, our Prime Minister has looked into this in a cool, calm, dispassionate manner and reached their conclusions. And I welcome the decision taken by the British government. And I think you shouldn't conflate your support for the existence of the State of Israel, which many of us do support, with criticising the policies of this Prime Minister in Israel, Netanyahu. You can also, by the way, condemn unequivocally the actions of Hamas on October the 7th and say it's wrong what's happening in Gaza with more than 40,000 men, women and children losing their lives.
The Israelis are pretty unhappy. We're going to be hearing from Ron Dermer later on in the programme, who's an advisor to Benjamin Netanyahu, who has said himself, he says that the decision by Keir Starmer is shameful. Do you agree with him?
Look, I mean, Prime Minister Netanyahu's advisor is entitled to his opinion. I think David Lammy was quite clear this week in the House of Commons in relation to explaining why he'd made his decision. Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, was quite clear today in Prime Minister's questions explaining his decision. I'm disappointed if that is the response from Netanyahu. Let's wait and see what happens in relation to the next few days and weeks. But all of us, whatever our views are on this issue, will be hoping there is an end to the killing in Gaza. It's really important that there is a ceasefire. It's really important the hostages are released. And for those hostages who've lost their lives, their families want their bodies returned. Thank you very much for being on the programme today. I know it's a difficult day for so many people, and as you say, we're all really thinking about those families impacted by the Grenfell inquiry, so thank you. Thanks, Sophie.